My brother said, "You own nothing" at our party. Bank managers said my name. He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You own nothing, Celeste. You never have. Why are you even standing here like you matter?" The glasses stopped clinking, and before that night was over, a bank manager called my name. My name is Celeste Harmon. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I was the child nobody in my family thought about twice. My father built a small but solid real estate business from the ground up. He started with one rental property and grew it into a portfolio that supported our entire family. When he passed, everyone assumed Derek would take it all, and honestly, so did I for a while. Derek was the one they always praised, the one my father took to every business meeting, every property walkthrough, every handshake dinner. He had the name recognition in the family. He had the spotlight. I had a desk job. That's what they called it. I worked as a loan officer at a regional bank, and I was good at it. I studied property law on my own time. I read financial reports on weekends. I learned how money actually moved, how assets were structured, how estates were built and protected. Nobody in my family cared. To them, I was just the quiet one who worked at a bank. I didn't drive a luxury car. I didn't wear clothes that announced my worth. But I had spent 7 years becoming someone they completely underestimated. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the one with the title or the applause, but I had built something in silence that none of them knew existed yet. Have you ever been the one who worked twice as hard and still got half the credit? If that hit you somewhere real, subscribe to this channel right now. Drop your story in the comments because I genuinely want to read it. You're not invisible here. Click hype and let's hear each other. Let's go. The party was held at my uncle's house. High ceilings, rented round tables, white tablecloths that nobody in our family actually owned. The smell of catered food and my aunt's heavy perfume filled every room. It was supposed to be two things at once, a celebration of what my father had built and the official announcement of who would carry it forward. I knew what the announcement would be. I'd accepted that Derek would get the business. What I hadn't accepted was being erased entirely. Derek stood at the front of the room with a glass raised and gave a speech about legacy, about hard work, about honoring our father. He talked for nearly 8 minutes. He named our mother. He named two cousins who had worked briefly in the business. He named an old family friend who had never once touched a property file. He never said my name, not once. I sat at my table and kept my face still. I told myself it was fine, that it didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered in the way that quiet things always matter, slowly and deeply, like water finding a crack in concrete. Afterward, I walked up to him. I kept my voice low. "Derek," I said, "did Dad leave anything at all for me? Anything?" He looked at me, then looked past me at the people nearby, and he laughed. Not a small laugh, a performance. "Dad knew you had nothing to offer the business. You own nothing, Celeste. You've always owned nothing." A cousin near the dessert table laughed. An aunt turned away. My mother looked down at her hands. Nobody said a word in my defense. And then, from across the room, a calm voice cut through everything. "Excuse me, is there a Celeste Harmon here?" I turned. A man in a pressed gray suit was standing near the doorway, a tablet in his hands, looking around the room with the steady patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. His name badge read Gerald Holt, First Central Bank. Every head in the room turned toward me as I raised my hand. Gerald walked over, nodded once, and said, "Miss Harmon, we'll need your signature tonight. The property transfer is under your authorization." Derek's glass stopped halfway to his mouth, and the room went completely, perfectly silent. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand what came before it, because that night wasn't an accident. It was the result of years. 2 years before that party, I started noticing something was off. I'd been loosely connected to the family business through email updates and occasional group calls. Nothing formal, nothing with real authority, but enough to stay informed. Then one month, the emails stopped. I thought it was a technical issue. I asked Derek about it casually, and he said he'd look into it. He never did, because it wasn't a mistake.
I found out 3 weeks later that a family meeting had happened without me. A decision to sell one of the original properties my father had purchased in 1998 had been made and finalized, and nobody had called me. When I asked Derek directly, he told me I'd been removed from the communications because I wasn't, quote, involved enough to contribute. He said it to our mother first, and she passed it along to me like it was a reasonable update. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I went home and I started writing everything down. Then, 3 months before the party, he made his boldest move. We were on Sunday dinner, the whole family around the table, the sound of silverware and small talk filling the room. Derek pulled out a document and passed it around with the casual confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. "It's just a formality," he said. "We're reorganizing the ownership percentages to make things cleaner. Everyone just needs to sign." I picked it up and actually read it, line by line. When I looked up, Derek was already watching me with that patient, slightly condescending smile he used when he thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. "She works at a bank," he announced to the table, "and still can't understand basic paperwork. Just sign it, Celeste." People laughed, and Aunt nodded like Derek had made a brilliant point. I set the pen down gently. "I'll have my lawyer look at it first." The table went cold in an instant. Nobody laughed this time.
I never signed. And Derek's response was to tell our mother I was trying to tear the family apart. That was when the phone calls from my mother stopped. 2 months of silence from the one person whose voice I actually wanted to hear. I cried about it, alone in my apartment, more than once. But every morning I got up, made my coffee, and kept going. Every time they pushed me out, I used the silence to build. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Here's what none of them knew, what nobody at that party, not Derek, not my aunts, not my cousins, could have guessed. There was a woman named Ruth, my father's older sister. She lived quietly in a small city 2 states away, and most of my family had forgotten she existed. She never came to holidays, she wasn't on the group text, she was what people politely call estranged, though the real story was that she simply refused to perform for people who didn't deserve the performance. Aunt Ruth and I had written letters to each other for years, real letters in envelopes with stamps. She was sharp and funny and completely unbothered by what anyone thought of her. She had spent 4 decades quietly buying and managing commercial properties on her own, building her own portfolio, completely separate from my father's business, and she had watched our family from a careful distance. She passed away 18 months before that party, and before she did, she made a decision. What they didn't know was that Aunt Ruth had been paying attention for years, and before she died, she made sure I would never be left with nothing. She left me everything. 3 fully paid-off commercial properties, all in good markets, all with tenants already in place. I had spent over a year working quietly with a bank and an estate attorney to process the transfer correctly, to make sure every document was airtight and every step was done by the book. The combined value of those properties was larger than the entire family business Derek had just announced he was inheriting. I didn't tell a single person, not my mother, not a friend. I had a plan, and it only worked in silence. The man who helped me execute that plan was Warren Aldridge. He was my father's original estate attorney, the one who had drafted documents for the business long before Derek was ever involved. Warren was in his late 60s, soft-spoken and extraordinarily precise. He had reached out to me shortly after Aunt Ruth passed, asking to meet privately. When I sat down across from him in his small office with the smell of old books and leather chairs around us, he slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, not a legal document, a personal note. In it, my father wrote that he trusted my judgment more than he had ever said out loud, and that he had felt pressure from family expectations to position Derek as the public face of the business. He regretted not saying more to me directly. Warren had held that letter for years, waiting to see if it would ever be needed. It was needed. Warren helped me navigate every step of processing Aunt Ruth's estate.
He connected me with Gerald Holt at First Central Bank, and together we made sure the transfer was completed correctly, quietly, and completely legally. Meanwhile, Derek had no idea any of this was happening. After the Sunday dinner where I refused to sign his agreement, he told relatives at a follow-up gathering, "She'll come around. She has no options. What's she going to do? Fight us?" There was laughter. Someone opened champagne. He was completely certain he had already won. My mother called me during that period and said, "Just cooperate, honey. You don't want to be left with nothing." I didn't correct her. I just said, "I'll be okay, Mom." They thought the story was already over. They were already celebrating, but Warren and I had been quietly writing a very different ending. When the invitation arrived, I almost didn't go. I sat with it on my kitchen counter for 3 days. Warren called me and said, "You need to be in the room when it happens." So I put on my best dress, I walked through that door, and I waited. Gerald Holt had not arrived at that party by accident. Warren arranged everything. The timing was precise and entirely intentional. When Gerald asked for me by name and the room turned, I watched Derek's expression move through several things in successive quickness: confusion, irritation, then something that looked almost like fear. Gerald opened his folder on the nearest table and laid the documents out with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Miss Harmon," he said, "I'm here to finalize and confirm the completion of the Ruth Harmon estate transfer. The 3 commercial properties listed in this portfolio are now fully in your name. All transfers were executed 14 months ago and are properly documented." Derek pushed forward. "What is this? What properties? What are you talking about?" Gerald handed him a copy of the summary without changing his expression. "These properties were transferred into Miss Harmon's name through a properly executed estate process. Everything is fully legal and documented." Derek turned to me. His voice had lost its performance quality. It was smaller now, raw. "You knew about this whole time?" I looked at him steadily. "I told you you owned nothing, Derek," I said, "in front of everyone, remember?"
He pivoted immediately. He told the room that Aunt Ruth hadn't been mentally well, that she'd been isolated, that someone had taken advantage of her. His voice got louder as his argument got weaker. Warren stepped forward without rushing, opened a second folder, and placed it on the table. Inside were Aunt Ruth's medical evaluations, all signed and dated, confirming she was in full cognitive health at the time of the estate decisions. There were notarized declarations, there was correspondence, and at the bottom of the folder was a USB drive. Warren opened a laptop, inserted the drive, and pressed play. Aunt Ruth's face appeared on the screen. She was sitting in her living room, looking directly into the camera, completely composed. She explained clearly and in her own words why she had made the choices she made. She said she had watched this family overlook Celeste for years. She said she wasn't going to participate in that. She said she trusted Celeste completely. The room was absolutely still. I could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. My mother made a sound, not words, just a sound. She looked at me and something in her face shifted in a way I hadn't seen in years. Derek tried one more time. "You're going to ruin this family," he said. I looked at him. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was just done. "No, Derek," I said. "I'm just finally part of it." The weeks after that party were quiet ones. Good quiet, not the painful kind I'd grown used to. I connected with a property management firm to handle the day-to-day operations of Aunt Ruth's 3 buildings. I set up my own LLC. I worked with Warren to make sure every ownership structure was properly organized. I wasn't rushing. I was building the right way, the same way I'd always done things when no one was paying attention. Derek hired an attorney and tried to contest the estate. The case didn't get far. Every document Warren and I had prepared was exactly what it needed to be. There were no loose threads because we hadn't left any. By the time his attorney reviewed everything, the challenge quietly dissolved. My mother called about a month later. It was a difficult conversation. She didn't fully apologize, not in the direct way I'd once needed her to, but she tried. She stumbled through it. She said she hadn't understood. She said she should have called more. I listened. I didn't close the door on her, but I didn't pretend the 2 months of silence hadn't happened either. Some things take time. I was willing to give it that. I chose peace over punishment. I chose my work, my properties, and my own life over any desire to make Derek's consequences louder. He was already living with what he'd done. That was enough. The moment my brother said I owned nothing, he told me exactly what he believed I was. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already decided what I would become. If your family ever passed you over, wrote you out, or made decisions about what you were worth without ever asking you, I want you to know I see you. Were you ever left out of an inheritance, talked over in a family meeting, or treated like you had nothing to offer? Tell me your story in the comments. I'm going to read every single one. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next on this channel, and click hype to help this story reach everyone who was once told they'd end up with nothing. Standing up for yourself inside a family is one of the hardest things a person can do. It costs something, but you deserve to be part of your own story. If you've been there, subscribe and become part of this community. We're people who chose ourselves anyway. Let me know this story helped you by clicking hype, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.